The number one killer of vegans is heart disease. The number two killer of vegans is cancer.
Mental health issues because of veganism. That's going to trigger a lot of people.
Well, there is a number of studies that show a very strong relationship, particularly things like depression. Veganism and depression runs very closely. Now, we don't know if it's veganism causing the depression or people that have mental health disorders choosing veganism. There's probably a little of both. The food companies know how to addict people. They study this. They actually have scientists. It's like if you had a heroin addict and they were studying how to make the best heroin that was the most addictive and putting it out there in the population. That's what they're doing with the food.
They create this processed food that doesn't satiate us, that's got the cool packaging, it's got the great taste, the crunchiness, the this and the this. And then these things build habits. And so even when you amputate someone's leg, you can't say to them, just stop doing what even you know is stupid to do, and they go back and do it.
Well, the problem is, what's the alternative? The typical alternative is eat some salad, low-fat dressing, and that tastes horrible. Nobody wants to do that. But when you say, hey, have a steak and eggs, there's a lot of people who can get behind that. Brian, I tell, don't listen to me. Don't listen to anybody. Just try it yourself. Just listen to yourself, look in the mirror. This is the thing, because it's very confusing. We get climate change. Is it real? Is it not? I can't assess that. I can't walk outside and say the Earth's rising in temperature. There's no way for me to know that. But what I can do is I can look in the mirror and I can say, I feel better. I look better. I wake up with more energy. I'm happy. You can assess it yourself. You don't need a doctor to tell you that. You don't need a guy on the news to tell you if you're better or not. This is the one thing you have that no one can kind of hide from you. Don't listen to me, but try things.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Shawn Baker, the best-selling author, international speaker, podcast host, world-class athlete, and former orthopedic surgeon. You are best known as the author of the Carnivore Diet, which popularized the health benefits of a zero-carb, high-protein, meat-only existence that has changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world, including Joe Rogan and Dr. Jordan Peterson. You have spent much of your life pushing your body to its limits as a record-breaking rower in national strongman competitions, powerlifting tournaments, and competitive rugby. You also served in the U.S. Air Force as an orthopedic trauma specialist in Afghanistan. You believe that animal protein is one of the most powerful tools that can help anyone reach and maintain a healthy body, and that by simplifying our diets, we can all achieve peak physical performance. Shawn, welcome back to London Real.
Brian, pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Great to have you here. Last time we did this in New York City in 2020 in January, before they were even using the word COVID.
Right.
It was crazy. We were in Chinatown, and then I came back to London, you went back home, and then the whole world has been a little crazy for the last 2.5 years, right?
It has. It's been a fun, I'm saying that facetiously, fun 2 years for sure.
It has been fun, very eye-opening, right? We got to learn a lot about ourselves and who is around us. So look, I want to jump into this. I was watching a bunch of your videos recently, and one of them, you were talking about straight out, look, I eat a dozen or 2 dozen eggs per day, 3 to 4 pounds of meat, and that's what you eat. And I'm sure when you tell most people that, they look at you and think, well, how is that possible? And I want to talk about that today and talk about some of the myths and some of the conceptions and misconceptions. Just to remind people, I spent a year as a vegan. I trained for an Ironman competition as a vegan, and I went through the whole thing. I got to be friends with some of the top vegans like John Joseph and Rich Roll. I also had Charles Poliquin come in here during that movie and call them all idiots. It was fascinating at the time, and may he rest in peace, by the way. It was great to have Charles here. And he's like the bad guy in the movie, but later as I went back to meat, I kind of understood what he was talking about. But I've been through that lifestyle. And towards the end of that year, I was just asking myself, am I staying vegan to be dogmatic? Because I have a tendency to do things until they're not worth doing anymore, like drinking and drugs. And I thought, wait a second. And I remember I had some sushi and some red meat a year later, and my body was like, yep, this is where we want to be. So I've been there. I'd love to get your experiences. Where do we start? What are most people's initial reaction when they hear about your lifestyle, your diet?
Yeah, well, most people obviously think it's crazy, and I thought it was crazy when I heard about it, 6 years ago when I began this journey. And I think it's because we are so used to a Western culture. This meat-based diet is very common throughout the world. Different parts of the world. We can look at Nilotic African tribes. We can look at circumpolar tribes. We can look at Mongolians. Southern Brazil and Argentina with the gaucho population. So it depends on your perspective as to what's normal. In the United States, a meat-based diet is crazy. In Mongolia, that's Tuesday. It's just normal. Parts of the world. And so, I've had a lot of people now do this. Like you mentioned, tens upon tens of thousands of people. And so now we have more data points that are showing that there is something here, and we are seeing significant improvement. I think, we're seeing this big push towards plant-based. You can't not be aware of this, right? And so what we're ultimately going to see with that is a drive to more and more processed foods. And this is the problem. This is why we see people that go on a whole food plant-based diet. They do see some improvement in their health. The same thing we're happening when we go on a whole food animal-based diet. The same things start to happen. The difference is with a whole food animal-based diet, you don't have the issues with fragility, healing issues, the mental health issues that are often associated. We have several scientific studies that show that plant-based diets are associated with higher rates of mental health disorders, osteoporosis and fractures, poor healing, and then all kinds of different deficiency states, stunting in children. And so we don't have that on a meat-based diet. And so it's been very, very interesting to see. Harvard University has now done a study on the carnivore diet. We've got 2,000 people on the diet. Something like 92% of the diabetics came off their insulin completely. 100% of them came off all other injectable medications, and I think 84% came off all oral medications, which is, there's no other intervention for diabetes that works that powerfully. So we're seeing some really, really neat stuff.
So you're saying there's a couple things going on here. If you go full carnivore, almost by definition, you're not eating those processed foods.
Right.
Whereas most Americans, whether they want to admit it or not, are eating lots of processed foods, right? Whether you're vegan, whether you think you're healthy, whether you're an athlete, you're probably putting a lot of nonsense in your body.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're getting this push to, we see these Beyond Meat burgers, these Impossible burgers, these cricket burgers, they want to see bugs now. And basically what they do is they refine these foods and they process them so heavily, they turn them into powders. And you think about it, could we ever have eaten powders in the wild? If you and I went out hunting, foraging around and, out in the UK, we would not come into powder. We wouldn't have a way to turn things into powder. And so the more of these powders we consume, it actually changes the absorption characteristics of the food. And so our microbiome, which normally will actually consume up to 22% of our food, they don't do that when it's powderized because it's bypassed. It doesn't need to have that done. So it's interesting, in the United States in the last 30 years, we've had a dramatic increase in the obesity. I'm here in the UK, I'm glad to see you're not where we are at the United States yet. We're still
Is it
about
noticeable?
You're about 20 years behind, I think. I think in 20 years, the UK will catch up to where we are in the United States.
You look around London, you're like, wow, there's not so many fat people.
Absolutely.
It's noticeable.
Absolutely.
Even in the airports and stuff,
Absolutely.
It's noticeable.
Absolutely. Most of the time when I see fat people here, they're American tourists. Sad to say. But, as we consume more and more of these powders, like I said, in the last 30 years, it's the data on food consumption in the United States has shown no increase in food consumption. There's no calorie increase in either food availability or calorie consumption, and yet our obesity rates have continued to skyrocket.
No calorie increase.
No calorie increase,
Really?
and no change in activity level. Yeah, that's
Really?
what the data actually shows right now. Now, prior to that, from 1960 to about 1990, we saw about a 300 calorie per day increase.
Okay.
But since 1990, it's been flat, and obesity rates have continued to climb. And the thought is, because we're consuming these ultra-processed foods, which bypass a lot of the microbiome, we absorb more calories, we also set ourselves up for gut dysbiosis, gut permeability issues, and that drives continued, weight gain. So it's very interesting dynamic.
Wow, that surprises me. I just assumed we were drinking more, sweet drinks, and there was more high fructose corn syrup.
We're actually eating a little bit less sugar than we were 15, 20 years ago, surprisingly.
Wow.
But our caloric consumption has not really gone up at all.
But we're heavier, and
we're definitely heavier. Yeah.
And that's because what you think is the makeup of the food.
I think the nature and the quality of the food has changed significantly, so that it's not what we eat. The calories are not what we eat; it's what we actually absorb. Right. And so if we're absorbing more of the calories, we don't have to eat as much to do that. And the nice thing about a meat-based diet is there's a difference between acellular food, these are the powders, and food that's still in its whole form. So when you take a steak, piece of chicken, an egg, or even ground beef, the cells are still intact. But once you put it through that high-level industrial processing, all the cells have been broken down. The energy, particularly with carbohydrates, there's so much more available to us, and so we just basically absorb more calories.
What will you eat today? Now you're on the road, you're in London, but what will you eat in the last couple days?
So I've been eating, I'm staying at a hotel, I'm staying in Kensington, a little hotel there. They have a breakfast buffet. I eat a dozen eggs for breakfast and a few, rashers of bacon. I have a little bit of cheese and a little bit of salmon. That's my breakfast for the last 3 days. Tonight we're going out to Blacklock Coventry Gardens or something.
Yeah.
Gonna have some steaks there tonight. So.
Okay. And then when you get there, what will you order?
I don't know. I have to look at the menu.
Okay. But a big steak or a couple steaks?
Well, I'll probably get a steak, maybe an appetizer of some sort.
Okay.
But, yeah.
And vegetables or no?
No.
Fruit?
Probably no.
So it's protein only.
Well, protein and fat.
And fat.
Fat's important, right?
Okay. So that's with cheese and things like that.
Right. Or the fat on the meat.
Fat on the meat as well.
Ribeye steak or something, yeah.
And do you prefer red meat over anything else, or do you like to mix it up?
I prefer red meat for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if your breakfast buffet had red meat, you would be
I would eat a steak if it was there, but it's not. Yeah.
But eggs are also important.
Yeah.
You just feel the need, or you feel better with them, or?
Well, I actually feel better on straight meat, to be honest, but I'll include eggs because it's convenient.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you've been doing this now for how long?
6 years.
6 years straight.
Mm-hmm.
And when you deviate from it, you feel it right away.
Right, sure.
And you're 55 years old.
Correct.
And you just won a rowing competition.
Well, I just picked up the #1 ranked time in the world on the concept too. Yeah.
Right, and that's a sprint, 500 meter sprint.
Right.
And you're 55 and you're beating Olympians.
20-year-olds.
20-year-olds.
Yeah.
You're not 45, you're 55.
Right, 55.
Right,
yeah.
all right. That's a data point that, it's one data point, but it's something to mention. All right.
Well, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
The #2 guy, the #3 guy, and the #5 guy. Guess what diet they're on?
Carnivore.
They're all carnivore.
Really?
Yep.
All right, so not only is it a way of decreasing inflammation and just having a better human life, you think it's a diet for peak human performance, potentially?
Potentially. I am now, there is a Michigan State decathlete. He's one of the top guys in the country on it. There is a guy who just made the U.S. Olympic wrestling team. He's on it. Several guys in the NFL, several top-level MMA fighters, several athletes from all over the world have done this. Rugby players, jiu-jitsu athletes, so yeah.
But Shawn, everyone knows you need carbs.
You need glucose, right?
Okay.
You need glucose.
Explain this.
So glucose, we clearly need. Our brain needs it. Our red blood cells need it. Parts of our kidney need it. There's certain cells that are absolutely require glucose. The nice thing is the body is designed so we can make plenty of glucose. We have no problem. My glucose is never zero. In fact, sometimes it's quite high, particularly during high-level sprinting and heavy, intense activity. So through something called gluconeogenesis, which is a conversion of amino acids or glycerol from triglycerides, from fat, we can turn that into glucose, all the glucose we need. And in fact, it gives you what you need, so your body makes exactly what you need instead of over-consuming, because that's what we often do when we eat carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, and I don't want to demonize carbohydrates. A lot of people do fine with carbohydrates. I don't think they're evil or anything like that. For some people, they just do better without them. I'm one of those people. And when it comes to certain health conditions, clearly there's a benefit from eliminating them or drastically reducing them. So I find that like my liver, through another process called glycogenolysis, so it breaks down the glycogen, your liver can increase that by 15-fold just with exercise, and I've had no problem. I've gone in there with relatively low blood glucose and pulled off a world-class performance, rowing.
And so, all right, world-class athletes can have a meat-only diet and still perform. they have to change their diet around that, or as long as they have enough calories and the time in between?
Well, it's, there's a transition period, so it may take several months, maybe up to 6 months for some to fully adapt to that. And then there is, certainly the issue of eating enough, because that's a challenge. A lot of people lose weight on this because it's hard. The problem with meat, the good problem is it's very satiating. The bad problem is very satiating. So if you're trying to maintain a lot of weight, you got to eat a lot, and sometimes that's hard to do.
Yeah, you have to almost kind of force feed yourself
sometimes,
to keep that calorie amount coming
right.
up. Yeah, I know what that's like. When I went on the vegan diet, I found that I guess I had to eat more, but I was training for the Ironman as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the meat is a good thing because you're not eating those carbs, so it's a great way to lose weight. I think people have always known that, Atkins diets, things like that. But if you want to maintain and keep glucose levels, you have to educate your body that it has to consume more.
Potentially, yeah. Particularly if you're an athlete, yes.
Okay, all right. I went to Botswana on safari many years ago, and I remember going out there and I saw the lions and they would eat the gazelles, and I remember thinking to myself later, they didn't have a loaf of bread with that. They didn't have a salad, and clearly these animals have been living for hundreds of years without complex carbohydrates that were farmed and then baked. And I just remember having this realization that they seem to be doing okay, and they're eating meat and meat and meat. Do you look at this historic perspective sometimes, or at least when you're having debates or when you're considering this?
Well, obviously they're different species, right? And so there's that caveat there. But if we look at, the entirety of evolution and all the animals that have ever existed on Earth, something around 80% of them have been carnivorous. That has been the default setting for animal survival. And to become adapted to consuming plants took a lot of specialization. And so we see these big ruminant, animals, these herbivores and other animals, they have this adaptation in their guts that humans, we have some capacity to do that. It's not, I think humans are omnivores. I've never said humans are strict carnivores. We are omnivorous. I think we favor carnivory. So it's something called a facultative carnivore, which means we do better with meat, but we have the capacity to do that.
It's like a hybrid car. It can do electric and fuel, but it prefers the fuel.
Right.
So if we have to, we can go forage and hunt and gather, but we would prefer to eat meat.
Well, if you watch any survival show, you know what happens, right? The ones that kill the big animal win.
Right, and that's the concentrated, nutrient-dense calories that you talk a lot about as well. So 80% carnivorous when you look at all those species, and that tells you something.
Well, it tells you that's the more efficient way to do it. You think about it, you and I are made up of animal cells, right? And what do those animal cells need for nutrition? Where would you find that? Well, you'd find it in other animal cells. It's very simplistic, but that's all it really needs to be. It's, we require certain things that are in our body, and where we get those, we get them from very similar places. Now you can use, I use the analogy, if you're trying to build a brick house, you're going to pick up bricks, right? You're not going to start with pieces of 2x4, right? So there is, the right tools for the job.
You mentioned ruminant animals. When I was researching this, I had to go look up what that meant. What is a ruminant animal, and why is that kind of important, just for eating those types of animals?
Well, a ruminant animal, the most common one we're going to be familiar with is a cow. So it has a 4-chambered stomach. One of them is a rumen. They've got other bosom and some of the other parts, and that's important in the way they have to break down food. So, for instance, a cow is eating 100 pounds of food a day. Probably more probably appropriate for what we're talking about. If we look at a gorilla, a lot of people talk about gorillas and how big and strong they are. And a gorilla's about 300 pounds, right? I'm 250 pounds, so slightly bigger than me. I eat 4 pounds of food a day. A gorilla has to eat 50 to 60 pounds of food a day because they're that inefficient. Not only do they do that, they have to recycle their food. They eat their own feces to recycle B12. And so if we're going on, saying eat like a gorilla, well, are you willing to eat 40 pounds of food and perhaps, recycle your food? So that's a difference there.
Yeah, again, back to my trip in Africa, I got to ride these elephants around, and I did a safari, first in the Range Rovers and then on the elephant. First of all, elephant goes much slower, so you don't see as much stuff, but what you realize is an elephant eats all day. That's what it does, 16 hours a day. And when it's not getting a little bit of a coaxing from the rider, it literally is just pulling up, and it's got to constantly do that just to maintain the calories it needs. And it's massively inefficient. And it's actually quite shocking. And you see a lot of these animals, they spend most of their waking hours eating.
Back to the point of a gorilla. A gorilla spends 80% of its waking hours chewing. 80% of your day is chewing.
Right.
Yeah.
And these ruminant animals have this fascinating system through all their chambers of stomachs that basically take these vegetable matter that we would never want to eat or could eat and process it into this tasty meat. It's like a meat manufacturing.
Well, they turn it into fat.
Right.
They turn it into short-chain fatty acids. So all the fiber they consume, that they ingest, they actually absorb fat out of that. So they're actually on a fat-based diet. So at the end of the day, we need fat, whether we get it from converting fiber into fat. We have some capacity to do that in our own guts, about 200 calories a day worth. That's where we hear about the benefits of fiber, because we get these short-chain fatty acids that we absorb as fat. So you can just eat the fat and get the same benefits.
Okay. Do we need fiber in our diet? We've been told all of our lives we need fiber. We've been told so many nutritional anecdotes.
Right.
Maybe we'll get into them today. But fiber.
Yeah, so fiber, that's a great question. So I haven't had essentially no fiber in 6 years. I'm not dead, right? Clearly, so it's not essential. It's conditionally beneficial. Now again, when we're talking about eating a diet that is mostly acellular, like we look at the standard American diet, it's a bunch of processed food. So when you add fiber to that, you slow down some of that digestion, you give the microbiome a chance to function like it's supposed to. You mitigate some of the glucose spikes with that. Fibers also produces satiety, right? So if you're eating these candy bars all day long, you're not going to get much satiety, but you put fiber in there, it slows things down, it has a volume effect. So there is clearly a benefit to fiber in the context of junk food diet, but when you put it in the context of an all-meat diet, it's completely unnecessary.
Right. It's just not needed because it's a completely different game that you're playing. But if you're adding a junk diet, it can actually make you feel full and slow down a little bit. Right. Okay. My grandpa was a cattle rancher in Arizona, and I remember going to the feedlot as a kid, and I remember it smelled really bad because he had 20,000 head of cattle, and his job was to bring these cows for the last few months of their life, fatten them up, and send them for the kill. And we used to get a half a cow every year, and we drive it down to San Diego, and I grew up eating meat, and it was amazing. Then the whole cholesterol scare happened, I think in the 80s when I grew up, and my mom actually was feeding me non-fat milk, so I grew up on skim milk because fat was bad. And then there was eggs and cholesterol and this whole thing that was, 80s and 90s, and became this whole concept that now maybe we're starting to question. And I was just wondering, what do we know and not know about some of those factors?
Well, first of all, dietary cholesterol doesn't seem to have an impact on serum cholesterol. Saturated fat does in some people, not everybody. So there's a lot of people going on a meat-based diet, they see no change in their cholesterol. Some of them do see a pretty significant rise. And so when we're measuring cholesterol, the problem is things like LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad LDL, is not particularly accurate. That's been shown to be kind of a weak marker. Now there's something called ApoB, which is a little bit more accurate. These are the actual particles which cholesterol is contained within. And when those go up, your risk goes up. However, that's assuming all things are equal. So all things considered, if your ApoB level goes up, your risk for heart disease has gone up. Now what also happens is a lot of the risk factors come down. And so we know that things like diabetes, for instance, diabetes is probably the biggest driver of heart disease. And so if you get better glycemic control, and that's what happens on a meat-based diet, we have people coming off their diabetes meds, their blood glucose completely normalizes. That goes down. We see inflammation drop dramatically. We see things like our triglyceride levels go down, our HDL goes up. So many risk factors for heart disease go down significantly. One factor sometimes go up, called ApoB or LDL cholesterol. Do they cancel out? That's a question we don't know the answer. Now, we've got a lot of early information on people they've had vascular imaging after doing this diet for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. The vessels seem to be very clear. So, like for instance, mine, when I had my heart scan done, it was completely clear. My coronary artery calcium scan, complete zero after several years on the diet.
Because the theory is that when your cholesterol goes up, that starts clogging, your blood, and will build up in your heart, and that leads to the heart disease. That was always the narrative. Right?
That's still in the mainstream cardiology will still make that argument. Now the question is, can it go up and your risk go down? And the answer is probably yes. Now, if everything stays the same and it goes up, then you've increased your risk. But we see a lot of mitigating factors that probably, don't know for sure. There's some studies in progress right now that'll help us answer that question.
Okay, which I guess gets to my next point, which is kind of around the food industry. So again, we got sold this no-fat narrative, these low fats, that then these foods started becoming high in sugar, low in fat, and again, we started morphing into all these processed foods, and we found out at the end of it, via some studies, that a lot of these companies weren't even being truthful about some of these things, and the sugar content went up, and we found that very possibly we were eating the wrong things. What happened there, and has that narrative changed? Do most people nowadays not believe that fat is necessarily bad for you?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, certainly, I think the main thought right now is still that fat is bad for you. Saturated fat is bad for you. Red meat is bad for you. Butter is bad for you. We should be eating, canola oil, soybean oil, margarine. We should be avoiding, maybe have some lean meat, eat a lot of vegetables, eat a lot of fiber. That's still the main messaging that we get out of the medical community. I think relative to the sort of the standard American diet, that's probably reasonable advice. However, I think it's also causing a lot of people to have problems.
Right. Okay. So if you're on the McDonald's diet, that might be a better transition. But if you look at that compared to, say, a carnivore diet, it's not necessarily superior.
I don't think so.
Right.
That's not mine. That's not what I've seen with now literally tens of thousands of people.
It's funny though, because like you can sell it to someone. It sounds like it makes sense. Look at this rich butter. Look at this red meat. And it tastes so good. Clearly it's bad for you. And it's, back in the 80s, it was like fat makes you fat, which people didn't really question, but it doesn't really make sense. And that, we'll get on to the veganism argument, which is not far behind that. But is it frustrating to you to see that kind of sold and that people even buy that without thinking about the science?
Well, I think the problem is most people don't think at all. There's a minority of people that even care about what they eat. I mean, really, the biggest decision-making point is, does it taste good and how cheap is it? That's what probably 90% of the people make their decisions. So the apathy is more a problem. I can deal with the people that disagree because I can put the counter arguments out very easily.
Because they're thinking about it.
Right, they're at least thinking about it. But when you have most people that could care less, as an orthopedic surgeon, I've literally cut people's legs off and they refuse to change their diet. And it's clearly because of their diet and they still won't do it. And so we do have some issues very significant issues with addictions. The food companies know how to addict people. They study this. They actually have scientists. It's like if you had a heroin addict and they were studying how to make the best heroin that is the most addictive and putting it out there in the population. That's what they're doing with the food. And they know it, and you can just walk around and it's everywhere. Everyone's addicted to it. It's hard to stop because it's free, it's ubiquitous, and your grandmother gives it to you. So it's how do you stop that?
Your grandmother gives it to you. What do you mean?
Well, she's making you the goodie little cookies and cakes and all this stuff. You get a reward for being a good kid, right?
Right. Yeah, and then the food company makes an even better version of that.
Right.
Because your grandma used to make stuff, at least it was 5 ingredients in her kitchen.
Right, and it took her 2 hours or 3 hours in a food company. There was an interesting study on, I think it was millennials or Generation Z, they stopped eating much cereal. And you think, well, maybe they care about their health and they're not wanting to eat a lot of cereal. No, that's not why. Cereal took too much work because they had to wash a dish. So instead of pouring milk into the bowl and eating their cereal and washing the dish, that's too much work. They'd rather have a little package they can open up, throw it in their mouth, and throw the wrapper away. That's how lazy we've gotten with regards to preparing our food.
Right, we've gotten super lazy. And so we should be questioning the kind of foods we're eating. I remember I had somebody come over to my house a few years ago and they brought candy for my kids and they're like, here's some candy. And I was just like, what are you doing? They're like, oh, it's nice to give kids candy and buy them ice cream. I'm like, why don't you just punch them in the face? Like, seriously, that's what you're doing to them if you think about it that way. But I guess we've got this whole history of conditioning.
Well, it's tough with a parent because you always you feel like I don't want my kid to live as like a monk or something like that. So there's always this, well, a little's never going to kill them. The problem is, it's their birthday every day. I mean, there's every day at school that's somebody's birthday or a pizza party or holiday. It just never ends. And so birthday cakes were meant to be eaten once a year. We eat it every day for breakfast now.
Yeah, in the forms of our cereals.
Right, sure.
So just to finish up with the food industry, it's a bit like our mobile phone industries. They're some of the best at creating addictions, right? Mm-hmm. But they create this processed food that doesn't satiate us, that's got the cool packaging, it's got the great taste, the crunchiness, the this and the this, and it gets you addicted to, like I said, the look, the packaging, the feel, the marketing message, kind of like the Marlboro Man, but probably for food.
Mm-hmm.
And then people just, without thinking it subconsciously, they're saying, this makes me feel better, so I'm going to grab it. In a day where I'm stressed and my phone's beeping and there's some politician on the thing, that they just go for it, right? And they ended up, and then these things build habits. And so even when you amputate someone's leg, you can't say to them, just stop doing what even you know is stupid to do, and they go back and do it.
Well, the problem is, what's the alternative? I mean, what's the typical alternative is eat some salad, low-fat dressing, and that tastes horrible. Nobody wants to do that. But when you say, hey, have a steak and eggs, so a lot of people can get behind that because it's viscerally and primally satisfying. You know when you're really, really hungry and you eat a nice steak, it's like, I'm actually nourished. Whereas you eat some of this, a cupcake, you eat it, it tastes good, but you don't get that profound sense of nourishment. So when you tell people to replace this junk food, which tastes really good, I mean, it tastes great, they do a good job of making that, with quote unquote healthy food, go eat some quinoa, go eat some kale salad, the compliance rate is almost none.
Yeah, because they feel like it's a sacrifice, because
Right,
it is.
right.
Now, well, I want to talk about the access, but you mentioned how cheap it is. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, if you want to see what the long con is, you go look at how cheap junk food is in the supermarket. It's like, it looks like it's priced below cost. And I know some of this stuff is, because a McDonald's hamburger is technically priced below cost.
Yeah.
If you look at all the supplements, the damage to the this and the this and this, they say like a Big Mac should cost $8. You shouldn't be eating it anyways. But I mean, a lot of these things are priced to create an addiction. What does the drug dealer say on the corner? First one's free. Right? Is that what's happening? There's just super cheap foods that are easy.
Yeah, I mean, if you live in poverty, you are automatically, going to have health issues, just because that's what you can afford. And that food is, very, very cheap. When you're a poor mom making decisions for the house, and you've got $100 to spend for the week, you get 3 bags of chips for $4. That's the decision you're going to make. And so,
sugary cereal,
sugary cereals,
Coke,
yeah.
And then that's.
Yeah, I mean, we look at, I think something like 60% of the calories we consume in the United States are a combination of sugar, refined grain, and some sort of oil. I mean, that's about 60% of our calories. It's amazing.
Vegan.
Some of it's vegan. Yeah, most of it's vegan, yeah.
Most of it's vegan, right?
Yeah, it can be, yeah.
The bad vegan diet. So, all right, my next question is, but Shawn, not everybody can afford a steak like you're going to eat tonight. Not everybody can cook eggs. That's probably a worse argument.
Yeah.
But maybe people can't get the access to the food you're talking about.
Well, I mean, outside of some countries, I think most Western countries, access to meat is still there. Still, now for the time being, and maybe that'll change as we get crazy about this stuff. But I mean, ground beef is perfectly fine. That's pretty inexpensive. I mean, you can go, I can tell you, U.S. prices, you can find ground beef still, even today with inflation, $3 or $4 a pound. A dozen eggs may cost you $4. And so you could eat for $7, $8 a day typically, which is, a cup of coffee at Starbucks, basically, something like that. So it is accessible, it's doable. You take into account all the garbage you're not eating, all the supplements that you have to take, all the pills you're taking, all the other things, all the time, all the prep time, all that stuff. It actually turns out to be about the same for most people.
Okay. It's doable. You just got to go out of your way to do it, because you won't necessarily be able to buy it here and there. Although you can go buy meat in places as long as you're a little intentional.
Yeah.
Right? And these days there are sometimes more options for meat.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about a grocery store, there's plenty. You can buy direct from a rancher, which I often do. You can, if you have the space for a freezer, you can get 300 pounds of meat for $4 or $5 a pound typically. Even grass finished. So.
Do you care about your meat as far as it being organic or what they put in it, or are you just like, just give me the goddamn meat?
Mostly the latter, but I'll put some caveats here. I like to enjoy what I eat, and I think certain meat tastes better than others. But I think it's important to realize that the data we have, the human data we have, comparing, say, grass-finished steak versus grain-finished steak, is not significantly different. There's no real. I've collected data on 12,000 people on this diet. Outcomes are no different depending on which type they use. Now, I will say, from an environmental impact standpoint, there are some very good and compelling arguments to consume meat that's been pastured a certain way. That is to say, high density grazing with rotational, frequent rotation and movement of the cattle. That has a very beneficial effect on the diversity of the land, soil carbon sequestration, and so it's a net positive. It's interesting. There's a professor, Alan Williams, who's calculated that if we can convert, again, in the United States, around 30% of our cattle ranches to rotationally grazed, high-dense grazed cattle. We can offset all of the carbon emissions in the United States, everything. That's energy, that's transportation, that's industry sector, just by moving those cows onto the land.
So a more efficient use of that land.
Yeah.
Because you're touching on the argument that cattle ranching basically has high carbon emissions, right? That's what's being called out. That was in, what was the movie? Cowspiracy. They went big on that, right? And they went heavy on it's hurting the environment, which is just another thing for the vegans or certain people to talk about. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so if we look at what's currently being claimed. So right now, based on a 2006 study called Livestock's Long Shadow, they calculated that cattle emit 18% of worldwide greenhouse gases. Now they corrected that number down to 14.5 because of a guy named Frank Mittlaner who's out of UC Davis, and he said, hey, look, you're doing a life cycle assessment. You're not measuring direct emissions, and so they correct that number down, but the true number is 5%. So 5% of worldwide emissions are coming from livestock in general, cattle making up about 60% of that. They didn't, and they said 14% comes from the transportation industry and 14% come from cows. The transportation industry, they didn't do life cycle emissions. They just looked at the tailpipe. So if they would compare tailpipe emissions from a car versus burps from a cow, it would be 14% for the car, 5% for the cows. But since they didn't do that, it's an apples to oranges comparison. Now the other thing that's important about that is the 14% is a worldwide global number. And so I live in the United States, you live in the UK. In the United States, cows are responsible for 2% of our greenhouse gas emissions because we have so much other emissions. Now, if you're in Botswana, right, cows are producing a lot because there's nothing else there. There's nothing to compete with. So using worldwide numbers to dictate policy in the UK and the United States, this doesn't make sense. If every single person in the United States went vegan and we got rid of all the cows, we slaughtered all the cows and all the chickens and all the pigs and all the sheep and all the cats and dogs, the worldwide difference in greenhouse gas emissions would be less than 1%. That's every single American giving that up. So is it worth it? Clearly not. And what would the negative impacts be? Nutrient deficiencies for many people. You would have to consume more calories, so we would have to produce more calories. More monocropping, which is degradative to the land, so it's destroying the soil. So it's not a solution. Veganism, worldwide veganism, will never work.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny you make that comparison study because it's like when you go to Starbucks in America and they take away your plastic straws and you're like, okay, well let's look at where most of the plastic pollution comes from Indonesia and all these Asian countries. And I think it was a congressman from Texas who's been on our show with the eye patch. I forgot his name. I think he had this argument with someone. Dan. I forget his name. But he had this argument with someone in Congress where he's like, "Do you think that'll make a difference?" Oh, I think it will. He's like, "Do you know that most of this pollution comes over here?" So just an American giving you a paper straw so you feel better about yourself that day doesn't actually make a net difference on the globe. And there's a lot of that duplicity going on in America. You just mentioned something else though. Global veganism is never going to be tenable. It's never going to be practical by any means.
It can't take off in large scale anywhere. We need the animals for agriculture in general. Where the farming would collapse completely if you took the animals out of the equation.
Because of fertilizer, they're all part of that whole ecosystem.
Right.
So it's not a possibility. It's not practical. And the vegans agree with this too?
No, of course they don't. They have some different outlooks, obviously.
So let's talk about veganism and just go into this. So again, and I've been there, and I think this gives me a good point of reference because I was not seduced, but I was invited for my vegan tryout. I did a year on it. I trained for the Ironman race, 90 days on my brand new vegan diet, and I was surprised I didn't have injuries because I thought they were coming, and I didn't have them. And I don't know what that was. Again, I was going more whole food, all that stuff, but I trained well. I had to eat more, is one thing I remembered. I had to eat more because it probably wasn't as nutrient dense, maybe. And I made it through. And I also got seduced by the cult of veganism, let's just say it. So again, I'm doing the right thing for the planet. I'm not hurting the animals. I'm all those things that they kind of throw at you. And The crazy thing is, Shawn, is that you end up really believing it, and like the food tastes better, and you end up hating consciously or subconsciously on anybody who's killing animals.
Right, sure.
And I felt myself do it, and I was just like, wow, look at you, and getting disgusted by like fish and thinking about the life cycle and all the cruel things purportedly being done to these animals in these different ways, shapes, or form, and it really gets into your head. Yeah. And again, I experienced it for a while, and then I came back. I have a lot of friends that have come on the show over the years. Timothy Sheaf was one of them, who was the vegan prince. He was the worst vegan. He used to call me out and be terrible to me. He used to bring fruit over to the thing and call me out, and then later he confided in me at one of my movie premieres, and he's just like, Brian, I started drinking milk and I feel amazing. And I was like, bro, you're the vegan prince. And then he finally came out and talked about it. So and again, when I stopped eating plant-based food at the end of that year, my vegan friends don't talk to me anymore because I got thrown out.
Well, you were never a vegan. I mean, you were never really a vegan if you leave. So that's the recurrent
So
theme.
address some of these issues because these are real, and these get sold to you. You watch a movie on Netflix. By the way, they're all on Netflix, and they give you some narrative that you buy into, and we're supposed to be rational humans, but we're not. Then we get into this cult. There's tons of these arguments that we're being cruel, we're saving the planet. But like at the end of the day, none of them really have that much weight. But people buy into it.
Yeah, I mean, they make some very compelling emotional arguments. And I think this...
Game Changers was the movie,
right?
Which
Sure.
is pretty a bullshit movie. But.
Well, I mean, if you follow all the athletes in Game Changers, almost every one of them quit and got injured, within a few years of that
And
movie.
they were never high-level athletes anyway.
Well, some of them were okay, but I mean, there were some Olympians in there, to be fair, but most of them, the Olympic lifter hurt his elbow immediately after his worst performance of his career in the Olympics. Even though he went to the Olympics, he'd already set that base up as a meat eater 2 Olympics prior, and then went vegan, still made the Olympic team, but saw a dramatic decrease in his performance. But I think the ethical argument, I'm going to eat a guiltless salad because no animal death occurred. That is a big fallacy, because when you look at the way all food is raised, animals are killed. Now people say, well, it's incidental because the crop machine ran over the harvester and most of them run away. That's a part of where the death is coming from. But you think about it, almost all these crops are sprayed with pesticides. They're sprayed with rodenticides. They're sprayed with insecticides. So those things are done intentionally. I mean, a pesticide, the name tells you what it's going to do, like homicide. Pesticide, we're killing pests. We know we're doing it. They do it intentionally. Literally trillions of small animals and insects are killed to produce all this food. And if they're not killed with pesticides, farmers are out there, they pay people to shoot these animals. They shoot any animal that's eating the food, they get shot, or they blow them up. If they have little moles in the hole, they drop bombs on there and blow these animals up. So there are trillions of animals killed for you to be able to eat your vegan salad. So and guess what? Those animals don't have a quick slaughter. They don't have a quick death. They have a slow, painless death of poison, bleeding to death, laying in a field rotting. This is what they do. That's the suffering you don't see, that there's not a movie about.
I can hear the vegan tears right now.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so you want to be clear that there is animal death even in producing plant-based foods.
Right, and the counter to that, vegans will say, well, cows eat a lot of the grain, right? And they sort of say but the actuality, the numbers are, and these are very clear numbers from the FAO, livestock consumes about 1/3 of our grain production, right? That's not all crops. I mean, cows aren't consuming carrots and potatoes and tomatoes and watermelons and mangoes. They're not eating that. They might eat some of the scraps, but I mean, most of the crops on Earth are consumed by humans, either in the form of food or things like biofuels. Like a lot of the soybean oils are turned into biofuels. In fact, all the soybeans, and so most of the soybean meal goes to China to feed their pigs. China's not going vegan anytime soon, just for the record. But 100% of those soybeans are turned into oil, which is all 100% human consumption. So it's not like, this argument that if we stop feeding cows, grain, that all these humans would have all this food. Most of what they eat, most of what the cows eat is inedible to humans. If you go to a livestock feeding area and pick up what they're eating, there's no way you'd eat that. It's not fit for human consumption.
Okay. So they're not eating food that people would be eating. They're eating food that only those animals would be eating.
Only about 10% of what they eat, humans can conceivably eat. So it's a very small percentage.
What about the other, we're going through the vegan lists of arguments. So environment, I don't like harming animals.
Right. So if you don't like harming animals, you just have to stop living. There's nothing going to get around that. And just, like I said.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.